Have you ever wondered what happens when a queen's final wish is revealed years after her death? A secret instruction, hidden inside a sealed document, waiting for the right moment to change everything.
I wanted to ask you a few
Some
questions
questions,
about why did you decide to write about that subject?
That is exactly what happened at Windsor Castle. And the person it affected most, Queen Camilla. By the time you finish this video, you will understand exactly how Queen Elizabeth's hidden clause reshaped the future of the royal family. But before we go any further, let me ask you something. Should a monarch's final wishes be honored forever, or should they be allowed to fade with time? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this question has divided the royal family like never before. And hit subscribe to Royal Talks TV, because we bring you the stories the palace doesn't want you to hear. For years, Windsor Castle seemed like one place no senior royal could ever be shut out of. That is why what surfaced behind palace walls has left even longtime royal watchers stunned. According to claims now sending shockwaves through royal circles, Queen Elizabeth quietly left behind a hidden instruction that didn't fade with her passing. Instead, it waited. And when the details finally emerged, Camilla reportedly found herself facing a restriction so extraordinary that it couldn't simply be brushed aside. Could a secret clause from the late Queen really change everything years later? Imagine being called into one of the most important rooms inside Windsor Castle, thinking you're there for a routine legal discussion, only to discover that a decision made years earlier is about to reshape the future of the royal family. That is the kind of moment that reportedly unfolded when King Charles, Prince William, Princess Anne, and Queen Camilla gathered inside Windsor's administrative offices. After palace archivists confirmed the authenticity of a sealed addition to Queen Elizabeth's estate instructions. What made the situation so startling wasn't just the document itself. It was the fact that Windsor Castle is far more than a royal residence. For generations, it has represented continuity, authority, and the enduring legacy of the crown. So when palace lawyers revealed that the late queen had attached a private clause carrying legal weight, the atmosphere reportedly shifted instantly. At first, it seemed as though the restriction might involve ceremonial duties or formal appearances. But as the details emerged, the reality became far more dramatic. The instruction reportedly stated that Camilla could never establish a private residence within Windsor, could not hold personal apartments there, and would have no authority over household staff or operations inside the castle. Even more striking, the restriction was said to extend into the future, including any scenario in which she might outlive the king. The room reportedly fell into a heavy silence. Charles, still carrying the memory of his mother after her passing in September 2022, faced an impossible emotional crossroads. On one side stood the woman he loved. On the other stood the final wishes of the monarch, who had guided Britain through decades of change. Then came another twist. Beneath the first page sat a second sealed document. Curiosity immediately turned toward its contents, but the solicitor refused to discuss it until everyone formally acknowledged the restriction. That refusal only deepened the mystery. According to the story, Camilla's reaction revealed just how personal the moment felt. Questions surfaced about why such a measure had been put in place, and whether the late queen had anticipated this exact confrontation long before it happened. As Windsor's historic walls seemed to close in around the gathering, one thing became clear. This wasn't simply about access to a castle. It was about trust, loyalty, and a royal decision designed to echo long after Queen Elizabeth's reign had ended. For years, King Charles believed the toughest chapters were finally behind him, especially when it came to Camilla. Then something unexpected happened. Not a scandal, not a public clash, but a silence so noticeable it raised new questions. What did that quiet moment really mean? And why did it leave royal watchers convinced a deeper story was unfolding behind palace walls? Let's uncover the astonishing details. What made this story so fascinating wasn't a loud argument, a public scandal, or even a dramatic confrontation. It was silence, a single pause that seemed to say more than any speech ever could. For years, King Charles had believed the hardest battles were behind him. After decades of scrutiny, criticism, and endless public debate, he thought time had finally settled the question of Camilla's place within royal life. She had stood beside him through some of the most difficult chapters of his journey, and many assumed her position was no longer in doubt. But inside Windsor, old questions have a habit of refusing to disappear. The real mystery wasn't about popularity or personal feelings. It was about something far more powerful: control. Behind the grand halls, historic walls, and centuries of tradition, there were concerns that had been quietly growing for years. According to conversations that surfaced later, Queen Elizabeth had once shared a warning with Princess Anne. Royal residences, she believed, were rarely shaped by official ownership alone. Influence could move gradually through appointments, access, routines, staff decisions, and countless small choices that most people would never notice. That warning suddenly became important again when an old restriction connected to Windsor resurfaced. Prince William reportedly viewed it as more than a simple instruction. To him, it appeared to be a safeguard designed to protect the future direction of the monarchy long after Charles inherited the throne. Anne seemed to understand exactly why her mother had put such importance on it. Then, as legal advisors dug deeper into confidential records, an unexpected story emerged from the past. The trail led back to a private reception years earlier. What should have been an ordinary royal gathering quickly turned into something far more significant. A disputed guest list, a locked department, and an unauthorized order reportedly reached Queen Elizabeth almost at the same moment. Those incidents may have seemed minor individually, but together they created lasting doubts. By the time midnight arrived, a decision had quietly taken shape, one that would survive long beyond the reign in which it was made. That hidden history cast a shadow over a deeply personal conversation between Charles and Camilla. When she asked whether she would ever be fully accepted after so many years of loyalty, the answer never really came. Charles hesitated, caught between family duty and personal devotion. In that brief moment, Windsor became more than a castle. It became a symbol of belonging, trust, and a question that still seemed unresolved even after all those years. From the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. Royal events, polished smiles, business as usual. But behind palace walls, a much quieter battle was taking shape. Who was already positioning themselves for the future, while the present still held firm? And why were certain private requests beginning to circulate through Windsor long before anyone expected change? Let's find out. Here is what was happening behind the scenes. While the world focused on public appearances, royal ceremonies, and carefully managed smiles, a far more delicate struggle was unfolding inside Windsor. It wasn't about headlines or grand speeches. It was about space, influence, and a question no one wanted to ask openly. Who was already preparing for the next reign before the current one had ended? During the final years of Queen Elizabeth's life, quiet requests kept finding their way through palace corridors. More room for Camilla's growing household. Greater involvement in ceremonial planning. More authority over staff and royal arrangements. On the surface, each request seemed harmless. Together, however, they painted a picture that made some palace figures uneasy. To Elizabeth, Windsor Castle was never merely a residence. It was the heart of royal authority, and every adjustment carried meaning far beyond furniture, offices, or guest rooms. The moment that truly changed everything arrived, not during a public event, but after a private memorial gathering honoring Prince Philip. A senior member of staff was reportedly instructed to prepare a group of rooms for Camilla's future use at an upcoming royal occasion. The problem wasn't the rooms themselves. Those spaces were closely tied to Elizabeth's own household and carried years of personal history. Granting them away while the Queen was still alive could easily be interpreted as a signal that the transition of power had already begun. When word reached Elizabeth, she immediately understood the deeper message hidden beneath the practical request. A private conversation followed. Camilla reportedly described the idea as simple preparation and continuity. Yet the Queen heard something different. She sensed a line being crossed before permission had been given. What followed was swift and decisive. Restrictions were drafted, legal advisors became involved, and protections surrounding Windsor were strengthened. Over time, those warnings evolved into formal provisions that could not easily be undone. What makes the story even more remarkable is what happened later. Long after the documents were prepared, Camilla discovered that Charles had known concerns existed. He had heard the warnings and chosen not to discuss them. Suddenly, what had begun as a dispute over authority became something much more personal. Behind closed doors, away from cameras and royal traditions, difficult questions finally surfaced. And in that private confrontation, the issue was no longer Windsor Castle. It was trust. Everyone thought the drama had already reached its peak. Tempers were flaring, old grievances were spilling out, and the room was on edge. Then a single sealed page changed everything. What was hidden inside it? And how did a decision Queen Elizabeth made years earlier suddenly return to take control of a battle centered on Windsor Castle? Let's unravel the details. Nobody in that room expected the real shock to come from a single sealed page. The arguments had already grown heated. Voices were rising, and years of buried frustration were finally spilling into the open. Yet the moment that truly changed everything had nothing to do with anger. It came from a decision made long ago by Queen Elizabeth. A decision that seemed to reach out from beyond her reign and take control of the situation herself. At the center of the dispute was Windsor Castle, not simply as a residence, but as one of the most powerful symbols of the monarchy. What looked like a disagreement over offices, staff appointments, and household access was really a battle over who would shape its future. King Charles maintained that concerns raised years earlier about household boundaries had already been settled after the East Terrace incident. He insisted he had never seen the final wording of the restriction and believed the matter was closed. Camilla saw it very differently. After standing beside Charles through decades of criticism, controversy, and personal sacrifice, she felt she was being left to face the consequences alone. What hurt most was the feeling that the memory of the late Queen was being protected, while the living people around her were paying the price. The situation became even more explosive when she revealed that preliminary plans for a permanent Windsor office had already been approved. Staff transfers had been discussed, communication facilities considered, and preparations quietly started with the expectation that formal approval would eventually follow. The revelation stunned everyone. Suddenly, concerns that had once seemed cautious began to look remarkably accurate. When Prince William stepped in, he confirmed that every proposed transfer had already been frozen. His calm response only intensified the tension. Then came another surprise. Princess Anne arrived carrying a second sealed document. She didn't hand it to the king. Instead, she placed it before the solicitor. As the contents were read aloud, the room fell silent. The document revealed that Queen Elizabeth had foreseen the possibility of a future conflict between family loyalty and royal duty. Rather than leave that burden to Charles, she had chosen someone else. The responsibility belonged to Anne. She had been appointed guardian of the restriction, entrusted with protecting Windsor's residential arrangements and household structure. In that instant, Charles realized something painful. His mother had trusted his sister to enforce a decision she feared he might never be able to make himself. The battle over Windsor seemed settled, and royal life appeared to be moving on. But was it truly over? What private decision was quietly unfolding behind the castle walls? And why could it reshape Windsor's future? More importantly, who was willing to make an unexpected sacrifice? Now, let's uncover the surprising story behind Windsor's most remarkable turning point. The king still sat on the throne, but inside the walls of Windsor Castle, something extraordinary was unfolding that even royal status couldn't simply sweep aside. What makes this story so fascinating is that it wasn't driven by public scandal, loud arguments, or dramatic confrontations. Instead, it came from a quiet decision hidden behind palace doors. A decision tied to the final wishes of a mother who had spent decades understanding the strengths and weaknesses of her family better than anyone else. As confusion spread through the castle, Princess Anne found herself carrying a responsibility she never wanted. There was no sense of victory in what she was doing. In fact, those closest to her could see the weight it placed on her shoulders. She reportedly made it clear that if there had been any way to set the burden aside without abandoning her mother's wishes, she would have done so immediately. But duty left her with no easy path. The deeper officials looked, the more troubling the situation appeared. Plans had quietly been developing to establish an entire administrative structure connected to Queen Consort Camilla. On paper, it seemed harmless enough. New offices, support staff, communications teams, and household management arrangements. Yet behind those routine details was something far more significant. A gradual transfer of influence that could eventually reshape daily life inside Windsor without formally changing any royal titles. That discovery triggered a chain reaction. Before sunrise, orders were moving through corridors that had long operated without interruption. Staff expecting promotions received cancellation notices. Office spaces prepared for future use were emptied. Access permissions were reviewed, schedules were rewritten, and proposed transfers disappeared almost overnight. Areas that once seemed permanently available suddenly required written authorization. King Charles understood exactly what was happening. The decision was painful for him as well. Yet once the documents were presented, acknowledgement became unavoidable. The moment those papers were signed, an old royal provision stopped being a forgotten secret and became reality. By morning, Windsor Castle felt different. Not because of any public announcement, but because small changes were visible everywhere. Empty desks, returned keys, silent hallways, and abandoned plans told a story that no official statement could fully explain. Sometimes the most powerful royal decisions are the ones made in complete silence. Everyone could see Camilla still attending royal events and standing beside the monarchy. But behind the scenes, something far more surprising was unfolding. How did a woman so close to the royal family find herself shut out of a place she once called home? And what role did Queen Elizabeth's final instructions play in a decision that left Windsor wrapped in an uneasy silence? Let's find out. Silence can sometimes say far more than an argument ever could. And inside Windsor, that silence was becoming impossible to ignore. while officials calmly enforced a decision tied to Queen Elizabeth's carefully written instructions. The emotional cost was growing heavier by the day. Camilla found herself facing a reality few people could have imagined. She could still attend royal events, stand beside the monarchy, and fulfill public duties. Yet she could no longer enjoy the simple privilege of remaining as family within the walls that had become part of her life. Many believed she should fight back. One trusted advisor even urged her to challenge the ruling publicly, warning that remaining quiet might make the situation appear justified. But Camilla understood the danger. A public battle would place King Charles in an impossible position, deepen tensions with Prince William, and likely push Princess Anne into defending the restriction with even greater determination. So instead of creating a spectacle, she chose restraint. Charles searched tirelessly for a solution. Questions were raised, alternatives explored, creative legal pathways examined. Could another residence be established under a different royal office? Could the arrangement be renamed and quietly adjusted? Each possibility collapsed almost as quickly as it appeared. The instruction had been written so carefully that every potential workaround had already been anticipated. Then came a moment that quietly captured the entire drama. As security officers completed the formal process, Camilla surrendered her keys. One small brass key lingered around her finger for a second longer than the others. She removed it slowly, placed it into an officer's hand, and walked away without turning back. From a distant corridor, Charles watched. He instinctively lifted a hand toward the window before realizing she would never see the gesture. Yet the most important chapter of the story was not unfolding in public. It happened behind closed doors when William requested a private meeting with Camilla. No lawyers attended, no aides waited nearby. Inside a quiet room near Windsor's private chapel, the conversation finally shifted away from rules, property, and authority. For the first time, it focused on old wounds, painful memories, and burdens carried for years. William understood that continuing the humiliation could damage his father and divide the family further. The question was no longer whether the Queen's instruction would stand. The real question was whether understanding could succeed where power had failed. Camilla expected another tense royal meeting, one filled with pressure and difficult decisions. Instead, Prince William said something she never imagined hearing. So what changed behind those palace doors? And how did a conversation that began positively end up reigniting a painful dispute over Windsor Castle? Let's uncover the intriguing details. Camilla walked into that meeting expecting another difficult conversation. Another reminder that in royal life, even the smallest decision could become a battle. What she didn't expect was for Prince William to begin with something she had waited years to hear. Instead of criticism or demands, he acknowledged her loyalty, her years of service, and the role she had played beside King Charles through some of the monarchy's most turbulent moments. For a while, the tension in the room eased. Yet the real wound wasn't about titles or public appearances. It was Windsor Castle. To many people, it was simply a royal residence. To Camilla, it had become proof that some parts of the past could never fully disappear. She admitted that losing the possibility of calling Windsor home hurt more than she had expected. After decades of scrutiny, scandal, and public judgment, she had hoped time had finally softened old opinions. Instead, one private instruction seemed to reopen everything. Outside the palace walls, however, events were already moving fast. By sunrise, details from a confidential legal discussion had begun leaking into the press. Across Britain, people woke to an astonishing revelation. A Queen Consort married to the reigning monarch would never be permitted to make Windsor Castle her permanent home. The news spread rapidly, and many saw it not as a housing arrangement, but as a message from beyond the grave. A final decision linked to the legacy of Queen Elizabeth. Back inside the palace, William explained why Windsor mattered so deeply to him. The castle held memories of his grandmother, reminders of his mother, and represented the future responsibility he would one day inherit. Every office, apartment, and staff appointment connected to Windsor felt personal. In his eyes, the castle was not property to divide, but a trust to protect for future generations. Eventually, a compromise emerged. Camilla would keep her full ceremonial status and establish an independent household elsewhere, while Windsor's private guardianship would remain with the direct line of succession. She accepted, asking only that her departure never be portrayed as punishment, and that loyal staff members would not suffer because of it. Soon afterward, Buckingham Palace confirmed that all parties, including King Charles, Prince William, Princess Anne, and Camilla, had agreed to honor a binding private instruction. The agreement prevented a family conflict, but it also exposed something far deeper: how memory, forgiveness, and royal duty can continue shaping lives long after history seems settled. At first glance, the wording seemed harmless, just a few routine lines in a royal document. But why did those carefully chosen words trigger outrage across Britain? What hidden decision lay between the lines? And why did it leave many questioning whether loyalty and sacrifice truly mattered? Let's unravel the details. The wording looked harmless at first. Just a few carefully chosen lines buried inside a royal instruction. The kind of document most people would never think twice about. But behind those calm words was a decision powerful enough to shake the walls of Windsor Castle and send shockwaves through the monarchy. Almost overnight, a debate erupted across Britain. Some saw it as a necessary safeguard for the crown. Others viewed it as a painful reminder that despite years of loyalty, sacrifice, and standing beside the future king through storms of criticism, there were still doors that would never fully open. What made the situation even more striking was the silence that followed. While television panels and newspaper headlines turned the story into a dramatic contest, King Charles refused to fuel the speculation. Commentators endlessly portrayed the controversy as a final victory for Queen Elizabeth over Camilla, transforming a deeply personal family matter into a national spectacle. Yet those closest to the king understood that his silence carried far more weight than any public statement ever could. Then came an unexpected development. Reports revealed that an agreement had quietly been reached. Rather than challenge the decision, Camilla accepted a separate permanent household and stepped away from any legal dispute. The arrangement eased some of the criticism, but it also confirmed one undeniable truth. The boundary had been drawn, and it was not going to change. The public reaction only intensified. Outside Windsor, crowds gathered beneath newspaper billboards carrying dramatic headlines about the late Queen's final wishes. Cameras waited for every glance and gesture. As one vehicle passed the famous gates without entering, many believed they were witnessing the closing chapter of a long and complicated royal story. Yet the real turning point arrived later, not in a courtroom or behind palace doors, but during a memorial service at Windsor. Camilla returned under the new terms, entering not as a resident authority, but as the king's consort. Every step seemed loaded with meaning. Then something remarkable happened. The focus shifted away from exclusion and toward restraint, dignity, and acceptance. What had once appeared to be a humiliating restriction gradually became something else entirely. A clear boundary that allowed the monarchy, after years of division, to move forward and endure. Camilla stood quietly beneath Queen Elizabeth's portrait and made a choice that changed everything. No arguments, no dramatic scenes, no public showdown. So what really pushed her to walk away? And what was happening behind palace walls that made this decision impossible to avoid? Let's find out. Camilla stood beneath Queen Elizabeth's portrait for a long moment, holding a decision that carried far more weight than any royal title. By the time she placed the signed document on the small table below the portrait, the outcome was already clear. The battle over Windsor was over. Not because someone had won, but because someone had finally chosen to walk away. What made the moment so remarkable was that it happened without shouting, public drama, or a single display of anger. Windsor Castle, the heart of so much royal history, had become a symbol of something larger than personal wishes. Long before that day, Queen Elizabeth had drawn a line that many believed would eventually spark conflict. Instead, it forced the royal family to confront a difficult question. Where should love end? As Camilla arrived through the ceremonial entrance, it was obvious this was no ordinary visit. Officials noted that she was there only for the service. The message was impossible to miss. Windsor was no longer a place she would ever call home. Yet King Charles remained at her side, proving that loyalty to his late mother's wishes did not mean abandoning his wife. Nearby, Princess Anne carried the burden of enforcing a painful family obligation. There was no celebration in her actions, only a determination to protect an institution that had survived generations. When the two women finally faced one another, years of tension seemed to fade into something quieter and more human. The future had already begun to take shape. Prince William had preserved parts of Windsor as a lasting tribute to Queen Elizabeth's household, while alternative arrangements ensured Camilla could continue serving beside Charles without challenging that legacy. Then came a simple gesture. Anne extended her hand. Camilla accepted it. In that brief moment, respect achieved what authority never could. Windsor remained protected. The marriage endured. And dignity, not victory, became the final word. So now you know the full truth behind Queen Elizabeth's hidden clause and Camilla's removal from Windsor. You know how it happened, you know why. But what happens next involves someone we haven't even talked about yet. And that story might be even more surprising. If you've made it this far, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell for Royal Talks TV. Because stories like this don't stay buried for long. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Should Queen Elizabeth's final wishes have been honored, or should they have been set aside? Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.